We're now going to launch into what has become traditionally our first panel of the day, which we call the state of play. And this year, the state of play we're calling Immigration at Center Stage. So the session is being recorded. It'll be available online. We're going to go until about 10:40. No, we're going to go till 11 o'clock, excuse me. So we have a good chunk of time here. And we have a wonderful panel. Our panel is made up of Dara, who is the senior reporter at Vox. Next to her is Barry Jackson, who is a former chief of staff for Speaker Boehner and was a special assistant to President Bush, working on immigration issues where we, I think, first met each other, Barry, when you all were working on a point system.
Absolutely.
And we were doing some technical backup work for that at MPI. Seems like a long time ago. Thirdly is Maria Cardona, who is a Democratic political strategist and a principal at the Dewey Square Group. And Maria and I go back to INS when she was Director of Communications when I was there. And then finally, Bill Galston, who is co-chair of the New Center and a senior fellow for governance studies at the Brookings Institution. It's been doing some very interesting work that I think you'll all be, I hope, interested in hearing about. So let me try to set the scene here in terms of the kind of a discussion that we would like to have this morning. And that has to start by going back to the presidential election in 2016, because 2016 and the election of President Trump is the first time, really, that we've seen immigration as a top-tier issue in electing a president. Trump as a candidate and now as president has seen immigration in a very different way from the way it's been characterized before. And the characterization and the narrative that the administration gives is one of immigration representing a threat to the United States, a threat to national security, and a threat to American jobs and workers. Now, this is new. It's not that we haven't had disagreements, strong disagreements, in this country about immigration for a very long time. And certainly there have been policy disagreements between Republicans and Democrats for as long as any of us who have been working in this field can remember. But nonetheless, despite the policy disagreements, there has always been a basic agreement within both parties, at the top of the party, Republican and Democrats, that immigration overall is a net positive for the country. That is really no longer the case. And so what we have is a new view, a different view, not a new view, a different view of immigration as a threat. And the way in which that took place and was discussed in the campaign has very much become the playbook for this administration's governing where immigration is concerned. Immigration has stayed a central theme of the presidency, and as a result, we are seeing extraordinary things happening, and this last year in particular has been an extraordinary one for immigration issues, and the pace of change as well as the nature of the changes that are being put into place. So that's the backdrop for this session, and what we would like to do in this session is look at how these changes are affecting intra and inter-party tensions and dynamics, what the midterm elections might look like, and how immigration is perhaps affecting midterm elections or could be affected by the outcome of those elections, the aftermath. And then, of course, the work of Congress on immigration. There are many, many more topics than we can possibly cover here, and I'm going to be asking very broad questions from which the speakers will have to determine how they want to try to narrow them in ways that make some sense. But there are such broad questions that I think it's worth at least putting them out there as a way of reckoning with the times in which we're living now. So I'm going to start with you, Dara. I'm going to start with you because of your role in the press and your responsibility, responsibility of the press to be reporting on all of these issues. You've done in-depth reporting on an enormous range of newsworthy matters. Public charge, zero tolerance, family separation, denaturalization, refugee resettlement, abolish ICE. I'm sure I've not even fulfilled the list.
I've done half of it, so.
So talk to us, if you would, about what it's like to cover this issue. Is it different or is it similar to other beats? Does it play differently around the country? Is it Washington totally and completely a hothouse, or do you get other kinds of feedback from other places where people read your work? And then I'd like to have you really talk about the stories for the kinds of dramatic changes that have been taking place. What's been the most important story? What's been the most significant story that you can think of? And what's really sticking in the public mind as compared to the din of just so many things going on? Will that affect the midterms? How does immigration relate to the midterms? So pick and choose, but I think that the questions are so interesting and the issues that are afloat, there are so many that it's just good to put them out there.
Sure. So, any idea of what it would be like to cover other beats is going to be speculative because I have no interest or desire to cover anything other than immigration, nor experience doing so. But even in the years that I've been covering immigration for Vox, the extent to which immigration is different from other issues in the public mind has diminished, frankly, right? We've gone from it being a fairly cross-cutting issue, both at the elite level and among people, to it kind of getting eaten up in this all-consuming culture war where, both sides of the aisle appear to not only have their own senses of what is important, but their own senses of what is happening on the ground. That means that, for some people, it means it's more important than it was a few years ago. I think that we've all seen that, lots of progressives, especially white progressives in the elite progressive infrastructure, care more about what the executive branch is doing on immigration enforcement in particular than they did under the Obama administration. I think that we definitely saw a great deal of that with the family separation and zero tolerance story, where a great swath of the American public really latched onto what was happening at the border in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time, if ever, for better or worse, right? I think that one of the challenges for me as a reporter, and I think for a lot of the people in this room who work on immigration as an issue full time, has been one, to square the fact that family separation became salient for a lot of progressives, not when it started in April and May, respectively, on the DHS and DOJ sides, DOJ and DHS, but at the end of May, when it got confused with the audit that HHS had done of children who had been placed with sponsors and doing the work of disambiguating the treatment of families at the border, the treatment of unaccompanied alien children at the border, and ICE's interior enforcement role and the effect that that is having on families who are settled in the U.S. has been a long, hard slog that hasn't necessarily seen a great deal of progress, frankly. It's been very difficult to tell people that the issues that they care a great deal about are hard policy problems, to tell them that there are other things that are happening that maybe if they're concerned about a certain principle, that they should also be, concerned about these things as well. And it's been a little bit hard to predict when exactly the people who do care about things, the, Trump critics who get extremely exercised about certain immigration issues, are going to latch on. On the other side, among people who would be inclined to defend the president, there's kind of been the opposite problem, where a lot of things have been happening that, in theory, supporters of the president were clamoring for. You could see a world where there was a great deal of excitement over the changes to TPS because there was a very, strongly made ideological argument that temporary means temporary, and yet people who are inclined to defend the president are much more inclined to defend him and attack the media than to focus on the things that are being done. Elite conservatives, probably it's because there's a little bit of ambivalence there, as I think Barry will probably get into. On the ground, there's more inclination to defend Trump as Trump than to pay attention to what the Trump administration is doing. And then neither in either camp, because they don't have a political vote or voice in the same way, are the people who are actually being affected. And as a journalist, one of the things that is most important to me, and that I think, is a particular responsibility that we as journalists have, is to make sure that the people who are actually being affected are getting the correct information. To make sure, especially when so many of the executive branch policies have chilling effects, that people who need to make decisions about their lives based on what is being done in Washington and what is being done by the government in the US and abroad know exactly what is happening versus what might be the most exciting to people on one side or the other. And that is going to be an increasing problem, I think, as we start dealing with things like public charge, as we see more of the relationship between docket control on the DOJ side and the things that Director Cisna is doing at USCIS on notices to appear and that kind of thing. And that is going to continue to be salient for unauthorized immigrants living in the US who have been kind of the one group that's fallen off the public radar in some ways because there's been so much attention to what's been happening at the border and what's been happening at USCIS.
Okay, very good. Well, Barry, you're a longtime Republican. You've watched changes in this party and changes in the way in which immigration policy is seen by the Republican Party. And so Republicans are now in a position where they control all the key posts, the presidency, obviously, and the House and the Senate, and yet we haven't seen anything happen on immigration. Can you talk to us about what's the core difficulty today within the Republican Party on immigration? It's obviously been an issue that's been important to the party for a long time. It's been particularly important to the business wing of the party, which is such an important or critical constituency, and generally has taken the view that immigration and immigrants are very important for the country and important for economic vitality. You're obviously, in your own experience, from an era where the big tent view of expanding the party, immigration being part of that, was terribly important. But we're in a different place now. So if you could talk to us also about whether what we are seeing now on pulling back from immigration might be an aberration, or whether, in fact, this is the new brand of the Republican Party going forward.
Well, let me start. Doris, thanks for inviting me, and Andrew, wonderful organization, not surprising. So I started deep into immigration in 2001. I'm only one of two people in the country that's ever been senior staff to the president, chief of staff to the speaker. So sometimes I get my pronouns confused when I'm dealing with Article 1 issues, so excuse me there. But my political friends all think I'm a policy geek. And my policy friends all think I'm a political hack. Mm-hmm. And it's this netherworld that I find so fascinating in talking about immigration, because I would put things a little bit different, Doris. One is that from 2001 till today, I actually don't think the views of the party, meaning the millions and millions of people out there that self-identify as Republicans, are all that different. I don't see that they have evolved into something dramatically different than what President Bush was trying to do, and when we were trying to do the whatever grand compromise or whatever we called it at the time. What I do see is that because more and more political hacks, the consultant class, are taking on an increasing role in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and the advancement of media, what has happened is that the ability to talk about the broad suite of issues in a rational sort of way has disappeared. And it's in both teams' interest, if we want to do shirts and skins or red and blue kind of thing, is to focus on the small issues, because they're easier to define, they're easier to elicit outrage. And it's not to say that the media shouldn't be covering those things, because if there's 100 kids or 10,000 kids that are being harmed, that's a legitimate story. But what gets mixed in all of this, I think, and President Trump's election was just kind of a validation that people are tired of the government not fulfilling what they think is its obligation and responsibility. And, when I went back to the Hill and dealing with President Obama and his team, they had great frustration with Congress. They chose to move forward with a lot of things with executive authority. They felt really good about that. They thought they were advancing the ball. But politically, they thought they would bludgeon the Republicans into eventually agreeing. Well, a president that does things by executive fiat is at the mercy of whoever his or her successor would be doing the same thing. And so that's this back and forth. And on the political side, I think one of the problems that the elected officials are having right now, and DACA is a wonderful example of this. The issue of the detention of the kids is another one of the full issues. We start the dialogue with, well, look, if we all just agree on this, why can't we just do this? Which, okay, kind of, in a linear kind of world makes sense. But I believe wholeheartedly that Republican voters and Democrat voters, on the whole, know there's no single rifle shot issue here. There's a suite of issues that has to do with securing the border. It has to do with internal enforcement. It has to do with what the status is of the 11 million or 22 million or 30 million, whatever the number is of currently undocumented. And it has to do with the issue of the naturalization, the assimilation, all those words that we struggled in the Bush administration, because frankly, for conservatives, that was one of the things that was truly what their big concern was, that if you came to this country legally and you wanted to be a part of the American dream, then there ought to be an effort to somehow make sure that being American was part of that process. And whether that was through education efforts, language efforts, whatever. I don't think that suite of issues is any different. I don't think it's gone away. And, one of the things, Doris, you talk about the business community. And granted, I'm a Republican and I'm supposed to love the business community. Talk about somebody that is not monolithic. How many times, and this gets to me what I think is the general cynicism of the voting public about politicians and particularly business people talking about the immigration issue. How many times have we heard the high-tech community talk about what a disaster? We can't get our H-1Bs, and oh my God. Anybody look at their profits, their growth, their expansions? They're taking over the world. So it's really hard to in a regular voter's mind who's just trying to get on with their lives, say, oh, really? Well, I don't get this. The same way, you think about the H-2A program, and you think about programs for more seasonal work in entertainment and hotels and all that, Disneyland, all that stuff. It's really hard to walk out into the public and say, yeah, we're cratering because we're not addressing this. And so there's this, I think, an issue after issue. I'll go back. The policy people generally have a big picture view of what has to get done. They could give you the rifle shot approaches, but they know that this is a really complex kind of issue. The political hacks realize that my job is to get whoever my client is, my candidate, elected. And once they're elected, not my problem anymore. And frankly, if I've driven them into a cul-de-sac promising things that they can never deliver on, good for me, because next cycle, I get to try to pull them out of that cul-de-sac. And so I'm frustrated by it, but despite how negative that all sounds, I actually remain hopeful, because I believe at the core, Republican voters understand and appreciate, just like Democrat voters do, there's something unique about America. It's why there's an American dream and not, no disrespect, a Filipino dream or a Russian dream. It is still something that calls to people's hearts from around the world, and Americans take pride in that. And immigrants who have joined the big fabric of America take pride in the fact that they've joined, and they've done it in a legal way, and they've participated, and that should be something to be proud of. And I don't think whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, or we can go through the litany, I don't think any single politician, and frankly, I don't think any single party is going to be able to destroy that.
Okay, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. I said we'll go through one round first, and then we'll start to pick up on each other's points. So let me stay true to that. Okay, Maria, let's talk about some of these issues from the point of view of Democrats and what some of the tensions are that Democrats face. Obviously, Democrats are feeling increasingly the possibility that perhaps leadership, at least in the House, will change. Who knows? 6 weeks can still be a long time, given the way things have been happening. But whatever happens, if immigrant voters, pro-immigration voters, and immigrants themselves as voters are going to be a very important part of this election. And so if there is a turnaround, it'll be interesting because immigration actually hasn't been an issue that by and large Democrats are campaigning on in these races. And so one of the questions is why are Democrats purposely downplaying immigration, even though it is very important to many of their base voters? And does that have to do with independence and the real need to bring some larger number of independents back into the fold, immigration not necessarily being a winning issue for them? So if you could talk a little bit about what the tensions are within the Democratic Party, what the tensions are obviously between attracting immigrant voters, independents, and then what that means if Democrats actually do take some leadership. What if they do have leadership and immigrant voters think they're owed something, but that is actually not really a winning strategy moving into 2020? Those all then, of course, involve also the Latino vote, the promise that we have all the time that the Latino vote is the sleeping giant, but that giant doesn't ever seem to quite wake up. So what does that look like? What do you think the Latino vote is going to be looking like going into the future in light of these other issues?
Great. Thank you, Doris, and thanks everyone for coming here today. This is one of my favorite things to do. As Doris noted, I've been involved in immigration for the majority of my professional life, and as an immigrant myself and as a Latina, this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. Before getting to the nitty-gritty of your question, Doris, I want to sort of peel back. There's so many layers here, so I'll try to be broad-stroked yet specific and also hit on some of the things that Barry talked about. For the most part, I completely agree with Barry in that writ large and in a broad stroke, the immigration issue hasn't changed all that much in terms of how different constituencies feel about it at a base level. And what I mean by that is that even today, as atomic and bombastic as the immigration issue has become, in poll after poll, you still see the majority of Democrats as well as the majority of Republicans do believe that we need comprehensive, sensible solutions that actually does include finding a way to legalize the majority of the immigrant population, the undocumented immigrant population that is here. But if you look at the news and you look at the protests, and even if you look at what Trump says at his rallies, you would never think that. And I think that's part of the problem of what we're seeing, and Barry alluded to this, in how the discussion has become very polar and polarized, because you have the sort of extreme views of each party in terms of what is playing out. But where I do think it has really changed and why we see this uber polarization of the immigration issue is the way that Trump has frankly weaponized the anti-immigrant sentiment within the base of the Republican Party. That is how he won the primary, the Republican primary. And you see in all of the exit polls that he won the Republican primaries because he was able to energize and mobilize the anti-immigrant vote in each of the primaries. Immigration and the way that Trump talked about it was the #1 issue when you look at exit polls of Republican primaries in each state. And so he has used that since then to his benefit in terms of keeping it as a mobilization issue for his base, and frankly, and I'm going to be very clear here, for his anti-immigrant base overall. And I have seen it, I have felt it personally. Whenever I do any segment on CNN, I get all of this hate on Twitter of people calling for my deportation to Mexico. I'm Colombian. People talk about my anchor children. People even want to deport my husband, who is a gringo from Oregon. So it's crazy. It is crazy, and it is because of this polarization of the issue. But I will say that Trump isn't the cause of it. He is a symptom of how this whole discussion has become more polarized throughout the years. And I think I see a lot of the base with the 2005 Sensenbrenner bill that was the most draconian bill in terms of enforcement and the goal of criminalizing being in the country without documents that ever happened. It passed with, it didn't pass the House, or actually I think it did pass the House, but didn't pass the Senate, I believe. But that was actually what started these huge immigration marches across the country at the end of 2005 and then the beginning of 2006, which frankly was a big impetus for Democrats taking the House in 2006. But also what you have seen since then is, again, an additional polarization where you saw in the 2008 presidential election, while immigration wasn't front and center the way it was in 2006, you saw Republican candidates responding to what they have seen as that sort of base instinct in the Republican Party of wanting to sort of close the borders, be a little bit more draconian on letting people in, be more draconian on letting people stay. And you saw it in, frankly, the candidate who represented the Republicans in 2008, John McCain, where he even did a 180 flip on his own bill, the McCain-Kennedy bill, which would have been a base for comprehensive immigration reform, where he said during the primaries that he no longer was able to support that bill. And he did it not because I don't think he believed it. He was always someone who was on the right side of immigration, meaning wanting to do something, a solution comprehensively that included legalization of the undocumented population. But he turned his back on that because he wanted to win the Republican primary and then ultimately the election. That didn't work in 2008. But like I said, in 2016, Donald Trump was brilliant, frankly, in weaponizing what had, again, evolved into a much more stringent anti-immigrant strain within the Republican base. And you saw it with all the stuff that he talked about, the border wall, the Muslim ban, even getting rid of DACA. The majority of Americans, again, Republicans and Democrats, believe that the Dreamers should be able to easily find a way to stay here. They are as American as everybody else except for a piece of paper. And so you have seen it in these pieces of issues that we have seen come to the forefront. The family separation, I think, is also one that has become sort of a bombastic issue. And that, I think, you saw a little bit of where Republicans got really nervous because the midterm elections are coming. And you have seen this, again, the polarization within the extremes of both parties. I think have now started to, the pendulum started swinging to the other side because it's gone too far, where you saw moderate Republican suburban women looking at the images on television of babies being ripped from the arms of their mothers, and they were like, no, that is not who we are as a country, that is even not who we are as a party, and there was a lot of backlash politically. And I think that is certainly playing into the midterm elections, and yes, Democrats are very enthusiastic about the possibility of taking over the House and even the possibility of taking control of the Senate, though as a Democratic strategist, I never, ever, and I tell all my clients, don't talk about a blue wave, because nothing is set in stone. Like Doris said, 6 weeks and frankly even 3 days is a lifetime in politics, and anything can happen. And we still need everybody to be energized and mobilized at the local level in order for that to happen. So then that brings me to the local elections and Democratic candidates throughout the country. And you're right, Doris, at the national level, immigration is not a big issue that we are seeing being talked about. But what we are seeing is when you look at the very specific candidates and very specific issues, they are talking about it in terms of who we are as a country. And they are putting it in terms, for example, using the family separation issue and saying this is not who we are. These are not the American values that we want to represent either domestically nor internationally. And so they're using it as a way to kind of bring the discussion back to where I think it has always been, and this is what Barry mentioned, where there is sort of a common sense, sensible way to look at the immigration issue, where you have an undocumented population that we all know is not going away, and that the vast majority of them, other than being here without papers, are law-abiding citizens that have roots, decades long, that have U.S. citizen children and grandchildren, and who have come here in search of the American dream and wanting to build a better life, and that there should be a way for us to regularize, legalize their status. That doesn't mean them cutting in line. That doesn't mean that they're going to, take all of the public benefits, which again are some of the extreme talking points on the other side that they use to sort of mobilize their base. But I think that the majority of Americans, and this is where Democrats, district by district or state by state, depending on what their voting constituency looks like, are talking about immigration in these terms. And you see it, for example, with Andrew Gillum in Florida. Florida obviously has a huge immigrant population, a huge Latino population. And as Latinos, even if you are, for example, Puerto Rican or even Cuban, where the issue of being undocumented is not one that really affects you, the way that they look at it is if they are out and about and somebody who doesn't frankly believe that anybody else that doesn't look like them should be in this country, which is the base that Donald Trump has mobilized and energized, has felt empowered to insult those people, to say, you need to go back to where you came from, even not knowing the fact that they are citizens if you're Puerto Rican, or if you're Cuban, you've been able to gain legal status, or even like myself, I'm a naturalized citizen. But even if you're a Latino from, let's say, Denver or New Mexico, where your family has probably been here longer than the person who's insulting you. And so you feel this personally. This has become an issue for Latinos that has been energizing to the community, that has been mobilizing the community. And this isn't the first election that we're seeing this. We saw it in 2016, and Latinos did come out, the majority of them, for Hillary, but we saw other demographics not come out in the numbers necessary in order for her to win the electoral vote, because let's remember she got almost 3 million more votes than Trump. But I think when you look at it district by district, there are so many districts, actually there are 25 districts that Hillary Clinton won where there are Republicans sitting in them right now, and those are the most vulnerable ones. But you also see other districts, frankly, where Donald Trump won by double digits, but in using these kinds of issues where you are putting our democracy on the ballot, where you are putting our American values on the ballot in a very smart way. I believe the Democratic candidates are doing it. I think you're able to mobilize a coalition that includes the immigrants who have felt attacked, the Latinos who have felt attacked, other communities of color. Frankly, I believe every community of color has felt attacked by this president and this administration, and the Republican candidates who have wrapped themselves around this president. As an example, again, DeSantis in Florida, who is running against Andrew Gillum. Andrew Gillum has been able to use the message that, you know, this is a common issue that we are all that we should all agree on. And it's the issue of American values, it's the issue of community, it's the issue of family, it's the issue of strength in a common purpose. And he's been able to paint DeSantis as essentially a mini Trump, and that has worked in his campaign. And I think that Democratic candidates are looking at this, again, district by district, and they are using it as an issue if it is something that they see their constituents really care about, because of the focus, the broad focus of what the messages have become in this election in terms of America's image and in terms of American values.
Okay, Bill, this is just a perfect example of what it is that we were talking about earlier about the broad agreement at the thematic level between Republicans and Democrats, and yet you can see that all the time. You can see it in the polling. It does not break through into what it is that's actually happening. We're in paralysis. So you've done a lot of work on this issue of the disconnect, across the board. And we'd like to tap into that now. Would changing the leadership in the House or the Senate, let's just say the House, make any difference? Or is there something deeper going on here that I know you've looked at, and I hope you will tell our audience about what are some of the things you're thinking about that have to do with Congress and the way it works and how we can have, not only on immigration issues, but certainly on immigration issues, this kind of a chasm between our political system being able to handle issues and what it is that is more broadly believed.
Well, thank you, Doris. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. I've been told that I have 7 minutes, and I have.
You can take 8.
I've decided that in 7 minutes I can make 3 points, because I see students, ex-students, and journalists in the room. I will tell you up front what those 3 points are. Number one, we are not alone. The United States is not alone. This has become a burning issue throughout what I will call the Democratic West. And I'm not talking about the Pacific Coast. I'm talking west of the Urals to the Pacific Ocean. Number two, there is a way forward. There is a way forward that makes sense substantively and that makes sense politically. Number three, the Congress of the United States, and especially the House of Representatives, as currently structured, is an obstacle to the expression of what I believe the will of the majority to be on this question. So, number one, and I'll make this point very quickly, survey research, including some that I've been involved with, documents the importance of the immigration issue in driving the outcome of the 2016 presidential election in the United States, and I suspect most of you know that. You may not know that it was also a decisive issue in the Brexit vote, for reasons that I can explain. And unless you follow European politics as passionately as I do, you may not know that in virtually every country in Europe, west of the Urals, immigration has been the most important driving issue in the rise of populist parties and populist governments. I could go through country by country, whether it's the AfD in Germany, or the League in Italy, or most recently the Sweden Democrats. And I could go through all the other countries. I mean, the Austrian coalition came to power on the strength of this issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not alone, and we are not alone. And here, Doris, I'd like to add something to what you said in your introductory remarks. In the United States and throughout the West, this is not just a national security issue, which you mentioned, or an economic issue, which you mentioned. It's also a cultural issue and a demographic issue. And we cannot ignore that fact. It has to do with language. It has to do with differences of religion. It has to do with differences of ethnicity and national origin. Unless we take that on board as part of our analysis, we are going to stumble at the threshold because we will not understand the passion behind this issue. Point number 2, there's a way forward. I agree with the previous 3 panelists. There is a sustainable and indeed sustained center of gravity on this issue that encompasses the majority of the American people, excluding the left and right tails. There is no way forward with building a physical wall. There is no way forward with abolishing ICE. Unless we cut off the left and right tails of this debate and focus on focus on politics as played between the 30-yard lines, we're not going to get anywhere. What is that? What is that way forward? Well, you know what? The basic building blocks of the way forward, which I'll be happy to talk about during the question and answer period, have been evident for quite some time. And part of the way forward involves a rethinking of the Immigration and Reform Act of 1965, which has dominated our policy for more than half a century. Well, the Immigration and Reform Act of 1965 was passed a little less than a half century after the previous great turn in immigration policy, and I believe that it's time to re-examine the premises of that policy from the ground up. I've studied the evolution of this issue in Canada, for example, and it is dramatic how much sentiment in Canada changed towards a pro-immigration majority after Canada reoriented the fundamental basis of its immigration policy. We could do a lot worse than look at our neighbor to the north as a model of the way forward. To put it bluntly, nobody in the world does immigration policy the way we do immigration policy. Nobody in the world awards the equivalent of 2/3 of its green cards based on family reunification issues. We cannot sustain this. Point number 3, the Congress of the United States, and especially the House of Representatives, is currently structured, prevents the expression of this Democratic majority. The power of the Speaker to keep bills from getting to the floor of the House prevents bipartisan coalitions that actually exist from expressing their will. And this is why I've been working with an organization called No Labels and a bipartisan caucus in the House of Representatives, the Problem Solvers, to come up with a package of rules that devolves power away from the Speaker, back to the committees, and away from the committee chairs and back towards rank and file members of Congress. It ought to be much easier for bills that enjoy bipartisan majority support to get to the floor. It ought to be much easier to offer amendments to bills. I would love to hear Barry talk about a very interesting case history. What happened to the 2013 immigration bill, which had 2/3 support in the Senate? What happened when it got to the House, and why did that happen? I think that's a very interesting story. So, to repeat, we're not alone, first. Second, there is a way forward. And third, we're going to need institutional reform in order for that way forward, in fact, to go forward.
Okay. Terrific things out on the table, and I'm going to pick up on the one that you just touched on, Bill, to Barry. What happened to the 2013 bill? And I mean in a serious way, in the way in which Bill is talking about it. I mean, can Congress, can the House, in your experience, which is so deep and broad on these issues, deal with an issue as important as immigration? I mean, here you have something that is tying us up and really, really creating an enormous amount of upheaval in the political system, and yet the political system seems to be unable to address it. Is 2013 a good example? Is there anything you can tell us that sheds light?
So just amongst us, right?
Of course.
We're gonna-
Amongst us and the C-SPAN audience, and they don't talk to other people.
Look, but I know what the common story is about 2013, but this is why 2013 was doomed to failure from the start. One was there was this over-the-top kind of elite view that, wow, Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney because of immigration, and demographics is destiny, and so as a party, we better get real quick and get on this. Number two, oh, how convenient for us, Marco Rubio. Number three, there was a long history, starting with the 2006 through 2000 effort of the Bush administration, to build this bipartisan, neither side is going to get everything they want kind of agreement. And so senators that had been around for a while knew that what was in the 2013 bill was not reflective of hard-fought battles over every aspect, border, union relationships, citizenship requirements, everything. And it seemed to a lot of people that were carrying that history that this is not a bipartisan bill. This is not even close to a bipartisan bill. Which leads to, you know, what Bill was saying about the challenges of the House. I'm a House guy, and so I will defend Article 1, Section 1 here. Trust me, it is not a smooth-running machine. But immigration is a wonderful example of we've devolved into this, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to force the other side to take my view. I'm going to bludgeon them into this. So the Senate, okay, well, we can pass this thing. What's your problem? You're holding things up. Well, all 435 men and women that have a vote in the House, they're representing their constituents as best they see how. They did not feel that they were part of that conversation at all. And they thought that the few Democrats and the few Republicans in the House that were part of that conversation were not reflective of their broad view consensus. And so, you know, I always have this thing about the White House, the House, and the Senate. It is impossible, because our founding fathers created it this way, for one to jam the other without you asking to be jammed. Now, I'll just give you an example, and I'll shut up. So when I was with Boehner, my counterpart was David Crone in Leader Reed's office. David and I probably had one of the closest relationships possible because our two bosses have told us, make this place work. And so it was not a abnormality that David and I would about once a week sit down with each other and say, all right, we can go this far, can't go this far. John's going to say X, Y, and Z. We're going to wink and nod. We know you're going to jam us. That's okay. That's how we're going to get this done. If you don't have that consensus up front, one chamber can't force another. The White House can't force. The public can. Public outrage can turn Congress on a dime. But that's why 2013 fell apart. I know that's so processed, but that's what.
With all due respect, I think that's almost entirely wrong.
I have a little bit of a different view.
Okay, Dara, and then Maria.
So, I mean, I think that it's really hard to look at what happened in 2013, where literally the biggest holdup was getting business and labor at the table on what ultimately became the W visa, if I have that correct, and say that it was not reflective of the battles that had been fought for the last decade. I think that was the problem with 2013, was that it was the thing that could fall into an increasingly narrow space of compromise where people felt that they needed to do something that reflected what everyone at this table has said is a broad consensus among the public about policy-wise what needs to happen. The problem is that this broad consensus among the public is coexisting with a very pitched culture war about what kind of thing America should be. And while comprehensive immigration reform, as it was structured in 2013, is a policy that could be sold both by Democrats as we're a country that wants to welcome unauthorized immigrants, we're a country that wants to respect family ties while respecting merit, and by Republicans as it matters that you be Americanized if you get here. We want to move to a 21st century legal immigration system. We want to increase border security. Because even though it could be sold by either of those as policy, that doesn't change the fact that the culture war is still, happening at the level of these are two visions of America that cannot exist. If I get one thing across here, I want it to be that sentiment and salience are two different things. And even though there's a very broad consensus around, there should probably be some form of legalization for, current DACA recipients, for example, even though until about 2 years ago, Democrats could very easily capitulate to any demand on border security, which happened to be the reason that 2013 passed the Senate to begin with, is there was a little bit of room for further border militarization that could get more Republicans on board without alienating Democrats, that the salience of that issue is less important to the people who are in the broad consensus than it is to people who are more invested in who are mostly invested in the culture war and who are going to be scared away from any policy proposal by the fact that people who disagree with them about what America is also support it.
So I have a little bit of a different view of both the politics and the specifics of what actually happened with that bill in 2013. And in my view, what happened in 2013 is that it passed the Senate with this broad consensus view where you had the U.S. Chamber of Commerce coming together with labor and the faith community, where you never, ever, ever see that. So it was the closest time and our best, it was in recent history, our best hope to get comprehensive immigration reform done. And that when it went to the House, John Boehner said very specifically to Barack Obama, I am not going to bring this to a vote because I will be sunk as speaker if I pass a bill with majority Democratic votes.
So
Because that's exactly what would have happened.
I am pretty sure you weren't sitting in the room.
Okay, tell us from being in the room.
And the fact that...
Is that wrong?
Yes, it's absolutely wrong.
Okay, so
It's
why
100%
didn't he bring it to the floor?
Because there wasn't going to be the votes.
There were absolutely going to be the vote. It would have passed with majority Democratic votes. It would have.
I'm just telling you.
They would have peeled off enough Republicans who would have understood that this is the sensible thing to do.
So Barry, my question then is, was the public representation that they were operating by the Hastert rule, was that
Yes.
not in fact a reflection of what was happening in the room? Because that's certainly what we were told in public.
Exactly.
Correct. But one, there's no such thing as the Hastert rule. It's something that...
It's a norm.
Well, and he's right, which is why the Democrats thought it was so ridiculous that Boehner would not have brought it to the floor.
So let me just start. This notion that Boehner somehow was a chicken about the speakership. He put his speakership on the line when he tried to do the budget deal with President Obama. I sat in those rooms. I know those conversations. That was not this conversation on immigration. This conversation with President Obama was not dissimilar to the conversation that Denny Hastert and Tom DeLay had when we were trying to do the 07 and 08 bill. So
why didn't Boehner bring it to the floor?
because it would not have passed.
Let me,
We all know what members say in public. We all know what the media likes to write. We all definitely know how the other side knows us better than we know ourselves. But I'm just telling you, the whip count wasn't there. It just wasn't.
Agree to disagree?
well, the whip count, I think probably what Maria is saying is the whip count among Republicans wasn't there. But that goes to the bigger point that Bill was making, and I'd like you, Bill, to just based on this exchange, help us out here in terms of the House and what you're saying about the House being the impediment structurally itself, because this is such a good example of how that plays out. You know, if you take Barry's point that there just wasn't involvement by enough members who could own the issue and could represent that their constituencies were being represented, that this was an elite effort that came down from the Senate, and that simply can't work in the House. How do you make sense of that in terms of what would be a better way to function so that that's not the inscription on the tomb?
Well, unlike the other three people at this table, I'm not an expert, on the day-to-day tick-tock
Right, but that's what I mean.
of immigration debate, which is why when I asked Barry my question in the first place, it wasn't a rhetorical question, right? I was genuinely curious to find out what he would say and what others would say in response to that, and I have not been disappointed. First of all, it is absolutely correct as a matter of our Constitution and as a matter of our history that neither branch of Congress has the capacity to, quote unquote, jam the other, right? And, we didn't have to have a bicameral legislature, right? And, most parliamentary systems don't. There's at least one state that doesn't, but our Constitution does. So, and if you go back to the Federalist Papers, you will see that the Constitution contemplates that the Senate and the House, because they slice and dice the American majority in different ways, will frequently disagree. So how is the system supposed to work? Answer, whichever House of Congress goes first in those issues where it is up for grabs which one goes first, it makes an opening bid. Mm-hmm. Then what is supposed to happen? If the question is a burning question of national import, and surely immigration is, you are supposed to have a counteroffer from the other house. And then the two houses are supposed to argue back and forth. They will eventually, as the textbook goes, go to a conference committee. I am old enough to remember when conferences actually dealt with serious issues and compromised on those issues. And so what we're seeing now, and what 2013 illustrates in my view, is the deafening sound of one hand clapping, right? The Senate made a bid. The House said nothing except no. You cannot make progress on that basis. So that's point number one. Point number two, and I can't prove it, but I am pretty. Here's point number two. And I just checked to make sure of my facts. The Senate bill passed on a vote of 68 to 32. If memory serves, at that time, Democrats had 54 votes in the Senate. What that tells me is that 14 Republicans also voted for the bill. It also was a bill that was broadly consistent with this center of gravity majority that everybody on the panel has nodded to based on public opinion surveys. So I find it hard to accept the characterization that it wasn't a bipartisan bill. It may have been a bill not acceptable to the House of Representatives, but I'm not even sure that's true.
On the Republican side.
I continue to believe, Barry, but I am really ready to be disabused of this, that if that bill had come to the floor, it would have passed. It would have passed with a majority of the minority plus a minority of the majority. And what the heck
think that's
is
right.
wrong with that?
Well,
That's the way the system should function.
that's of course been the prevailing question. That's the way.
So, Kate,
Go
can I
ahead,
say,
Barry.
though, that, you know, Bill, as usual, you gave a very high-minded and perfectly responsible, reasonable analysis.
Oh, I apologize. My mistake.
Dare you?
But when has any of that phraseology ever applied to our political system and political class? And the thing about the whether it's the 13 bill or whether you are where you are today, the simple fact is it goes back to the weaponization of this issue by academics, by press, by political hacks. And here's why the 2013 bill would have been a problem. Is that as you started to go through specific issue sets, and there were places where Schumer had advanced the ball far beyond the comfort level, and nobody could see
Of who?
of Republicans. And it was really hard to see, well, where did Republicans advance the ball that discomforted Democrats? And not that this is a childish, I get one, you get one kind of game, but that is how this works. I'm going to compromise, you're going to...
They did on the border.
Okay, all right.
No,
Well,
I have
I
to
think we're
say-
going to stop.
I find it absurd that in a year when we've had more policy movement than any other year in my memory, that we're talking about something
Right.
that happened in Congress 5 years ago.
I mean, we know, I think we have to, it is what it is. It happened. There is still remaining disagreement about how and why. The bottom line is, we're in a paralysis.
Right.
And it's a paralysis that is strongly disconnected from what, in general, the public view is. So we now, as you say, Dara, are dealing with lots of other moving parts, many other issues that are underway, with extraordinary executive authority being exerted in ways that was really a criticism of the Obama administration, but is in fact now happening because any administration, I would argue, is going to use executive authority when you have this kind of frustration with the Congress that continues to persist, whatever the reasons. So we have several minutes left in this session, and this is intended to be an interactive conversation and conference, and so I'm going to open the floor to questions. There are microphones in both aisles, and so please, take advantage of queuing up. And while you're doing that, since I don't see anybody there yet, Dara, you raised the point about all of the other issues and all of the other things that have been changing this year. What as a reporter, what strikes you as the most important and telling?
I mean, I think that this thing that's probably going to last the longest is family separation for the reasons that Maria was talking about, because there's a segment of the population that believes that it's the biggest expression of a moral monstrousness that they perceive in this administration. But I think that for those of us who can afford to be a little bit more detail-oriented, in terms of hitting the most themes, like the fact that we haven't talked about a major Supreme Court decision in U.S. v. Hawaii is illustrative of just how much has happened this year. But I think we've seen from the way that case worked its way through the court and the succeeding bans with the administration learning implementation as it went along and ultimately finding something that could pass court muster, to the fact that in early decisions there was clearly less deference given to the Trump administration than there would be in prior administrations because of what Donald Trump had said on the campaign trail, which is something we've also seen in other litigation against the administration on this issue, to now the fact that after the Supreme Court, upheld the third version of the ban, there is a question of implementation that is, beginning to get litigated with the question about waivers, but that is much, much, much harder to litigate than the initial proclamation level litigation was. We're hitting a lot of the themes that are going to define this administration. We're seeing that the administration moves first and is then checked or not checked by the courts. We're seeing that the extent to which the administration plans things out in advance is the determinant of whether or not there's a great deal of public backlash against it. And we're seeing that it's much, much harder to pull together individual cases into trends than it is to deal with, as a public, in addition to as a polity, to deal with things that are being announced at the outset.
Okay, I see you were up first, so please tell us your name and ask your question.
Yes, Abel Nunez from the Central American Research Center. In your presentations, I heard a couple of things. One, that in broad terms, people are coming, for the American dream. And I also heard from Bill that he talked about that we're not alone. It's happening all over the place. But can you add sort of the context of the fact that some people are leaving their nightmare, their country of origin nightmare, and in large part where the U.S. has had involvement in, right? So when we look at the border crisis right now with the families, it's a Central American crisis, and that is due because of the long history of intervention of the U.S. And so where's the responsibility to address that? And then the other part of it is, yes, the demographic changes, and how do we move forward when a dominant culture may be afraid of what this immigration sort of tends, although the browning of America is not due to migration, but it is to procreation. And so how do we move forward when there is a sentiment, yes, we believe in immigration, but yes, the dominant culture may lose its sort of majority. It doesn't mean it'll lose its power, but its majority. And in that case, how do we put that foreign policy that the U.S. has around the world? Because immigration is not something that happens to the U.S. It is something that, to a certain extent, the U.S. goes out, interferes, and for sometimes good things. I mean, they want to promote democracy, but in that process, there are consequences and collateral damage. And so what we see are flows into the U.S., particularly with the Central American experience. So if you could speak to that, appreciate it. Thank you.
Are you directing your question at anybody specifically?
For the panel.
The panel. Well, we're not going to have everybody respond to that. But this issue of foreign policy and its role in immigration is a very important one, and it's obviously most often been expressed in the humanitarian streams where immigration is concerned. But how it is that foreign policy is treated by the current administration in its thinking is also a real shift. Dara, do you want to speak to that? Because you've been reporting on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, one of the most interesting questions going into before the next time we all meet next year is what treatment of Venezuela is going to be. Because the administration, while it's generally used foreign policy as an auxiliary to its immigration policy, between the on Central America, the administration has veered drastically between promising governments whatever they want so that they can address root causes and, say that they're doing something without having to accept people who are fleeing, to threatening to cut off foreign aid for exactly the same reason, because President Trump is convinced that they must be letting people leave. On Venezuela, however, there has been something of an ideological commitment that actually comes from the State Department to criticizing the Maduro government and to supporting the people who are being oppressed there. And while, how that looks on the foreign policy side is still entirely to be determined, it does mean that there's something of the same ideological DNA that under the Reagan administration led to things like a more permissive policy toward refugees from certain Central American countries, because they disagreed with the reigning government and therefore felt that there was a case for accepting people who were criticizing that government as political asylees. If the Trump administration continues to say things about Venezuela, but doesn't, for example, increase the asylum acceptance rate of current Venezuelan asylum seekers, exhibits as little interest as it's exhibited so far in the Venezuelan refugee crisis in Colombia and Brazil, that's going to be an indication that the administration isn't going to let its foreign policy get in the way of its immigration restrictionism.
Any other comments on that point? Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook. I've been covering immigration in Congress since 2005, and I've written 2 books on how immigration laws have evolved and the politics and policies have evolved in this country from really colonial times. My reporting has found that the big issues in Congress on immigration is really the broad issues between whether reform should be comprehensive in a large package, as Maria said, including the legalization of most of the people who are here illegally, and piecemeal. And Ryan has made it very clear that he would consider piecemeal reform, including the DREAM Act, the KIDS Act, as the Republicans call it. So I'm wondering how you see before the next election cycle, before 2020, the possibility of a kind of sort of comprehensive immigration bill that includes various pieces of immigration reform that many, both Republicans and Democrats, agree on, including the legalization of certain foreign students. And please let me comment, I don't think it's helpful to label people who want to change immigration numbers or who want to enforce the rules, to call them anti-immigrant, Maria. I just don't think people are incredibly insulted to be called anti-immigrant when they're really advocating for the enforcement of immigration laws or the management of immigration. So I don't think that helps the conversation. And Doris, I wonder what your definition of an immigrant voter is, because most people in this room, law students, know that immigrants who are by definition not citizens can't vote.
Right,
So
but naturalized
those-
citizens who have an immigrant background, obviously, eligible voters.
Can I address just really quickly what Peggy said about the anti-immigrant label? I say that because that is absolutely the perception that exists in immigrant communities that see these policies that the Trump administration is putting out, and not just the policies, but the rhetoric that he uses, and many of the candidates that have become mini-Trumps, the rhetoric that they use, these immigrants and these communities of color are absolutely, talk about insulted. These immigrant communities feel incredibly insulted that the President of the United States would divide the country the way that he has since the beginning of his campaign, when he called Mexicans rapists and criminals. That is absolutely the sentiment, and I will continue to use that phrase, anti-immigrant policies, because that is how the immigrant population feels.
I think in terms of what Congress is likely to do in the next 2 years, it's going to depend entirely on what the administration decides its deal breakers are. And what we saw over winter of last year is that the administration cannot seem to keep its line straight about that, right? We saw the deal breakers on DACA go from wall to wall and chain and the diversity visa program to wall and the diversity visa program and quote unquote chain migration to wall and the diversity visa program and quote unquote chain migration and the quote unquote loopholes in asylum policy at the border. It's without having something that the great negotiator Donald Trump is actually asking for, we're going to have a replay of that one afternoon where Chuck Schumer thought he had a deal on DACA for wall and then got a call from John Kelly that actually the president had reconsidered and wasn't going to do that over and over and over again. Because as much as people at this table would say that there is among Republicans or among Republicans in Congress a certain sentiment about what should happen, that is not what is actually driving the conversation. What's driving the conversation is, can the president provide me political cover by supporting this bill?
Well, and
Barry,
and
I want to
just
pull you into this.
Yeah, just one part, because having wrestled with this, do you go rifle shot or you do the
Right.
big deal? And my history of this, since the beginning of my involvement with the Bush administration, has been, as ugly as it is, the deal is the only way forward.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, if I'm going to, everybody holds each other hostage, and I don't like using that word, but for instance, if you get all of the work visa requirements set, and whether it's a point system or it's a temporary worker, whatever it is, and all of a sudden the ag guys stand up and go, wait a minute, you're trying to force these ridiculous healthcare, housing, blah, blah, blah standards on us. Well, you're going to have a whole group of members, and not just Republicans, go, we got to get this part addressed. Mm-hmm. And so the beauty of saying we're either going to do this all or we're going to do none of it is it forces people to be real. In my experience in the White House, the oddness of sitting at a table with the chamber and LSAO talking these things through is that it forced them to say, okay, this part's legitimate, this is a bridge too far, how we're going to get there. And it was the vote of this junior senator from Illinois who broke the grand deal by voting for an amendment after Kennedy and Kyle and everybody had agreed, we're not going to vote for any amendments because we're going to hold this intact. That's the only way forward.
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I think Barry is absolutely right, that it's really all or just about nothing. I'm in favor of all. That's point number one. Point number two, Peggy, I am deeply skeptical that any major immigration legislation or bill is going to move forward between the midterms and the presidential election. I believe that the only way this happens is now that the president has stated his case in clear and unmistakable terms, the Democratic presidential nominee is going to have to stand up and articulate a position that represents the broad American majority and get elected on that basis. Yeah. Otherwise, there will be no change. Yeah. Final point. You used a key word, legislation. Okay? In the absence of legislation, the executive does more than the executive should do, and the courts are called upon to do more than the courts should do. If we have three, I'm sorry to sound high-minded and constitutional, Barry, but this is what I genuinely believe.
I'm 100% with you.
That if you have a government, a stool that's supposed to stand on three legs, and one of the legs is broken, how's the stool supposed to stand? Yeah. Right? Without a functioning Congress, we're going to replay this ugly drama over and over and over again. Obama overreached with executive orders. The current president is overreaching with executive orders. The Congress has to blow the whistle and say, this is going to be the new legal regime on immigration for the country. And obviously, if the president is not part of the team pushing for a new legal regime, nothing is going to happen.
And the one amendment to that, Congress moving forward, which is critical, that is why it's Article 1, they can't resort to mealy-mouthed, mamby-pamby legislative language, which infuriates the courts going, wait a minute, why is this my decision? Yeah. You guys are the one that wrote the law. Why am I the one trying to interpret your squirrely words?
I mean, I think this is broadly true, but there's a reason that the plenary power exists on immigration, right? Like, we actually are dealing with an issue where the executive branch has been given, both by Congress and the courts, an extraordinary amount of discretion because so much of this is based in case-by-case adjudication. And while I understand I understand the feeling that we're in a state of disequilibrium. I think we've been in a state of disequilibrium from 1996 at very least. I don't think it's super fair to say that we are in a situation where the things that the administration or the previous administration have done are overreach just because they are more aggressive than we're used to seeing on other issues. What we're seeing right now is stepping into a space of discretion that has been left and using that discretion in ways we haven't seen before. That doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it unprecedented.
Okay, I'm going to have to declare that the last word. I'm very sorry. I'll invite you to come up and ask your question if you'd like to, but we're at break time and we've had an enormously rich conversation here with so many angles, points of view and angles of vision on all this. So I want to thank you so very much for participating. And, we do really try to have dialogue and civil discourse here, and we tried to stay within those boundaries, recognizing, of course, that there are such strong points of view and strong disagreements. But we've got tremendous history here, and I'm glad that we've been able to bring it forth. So for the audience, we break now. Please come back about 11:25 so that we can start sharply at 11:30 on the next session, and thank our speakers.